Okay, hello. My name is Helga Embacher. I'm from the University of Salzburg, and so you can hear from my accent, I'm approaching British anti-Semitism from abroad, and I think from an Austrian perspective. Since the beginning of the 21st century, several debates about anti-Semitism, or the so-called new anti-Semitism, were conducted in the UK, whereby the focus was on the left or radical and on anti-Semitism among British Muslims. As in other European countries, anti-Semitism increased with escalations in the Middle East, such as the Second Intifada, the war in Lebanon, the wars in Gaza, 2009, 10, 12, and 14. Since the Intifada was overlaid by 9/11, and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism very often mixed with anti-Americanism. Particularly the Stop the War Coalition and the Israel boycott movement, which worked very closely together, are often seen as the main vehicles of anti-Semitism. Based on analysis of these two organizations, this paper discusses the various images of Jews, Israel, and Palestine, as well as defense strategies against charges of anti-Semitism. For starters, I will provide a short characterization of the Stop the War Coalition and the boycott movement. So I start with the Stop the War Coalition. The Stop the War Coalition was founded in September 2001 to protest against the war in Afghanistan. This extremely heterogeneous movement was orchestrated by Trotskyite Socialist Worker Party members, communists, and left-wing Labour members such as Jeremy Coburn or the former Labour member George Galloway. In the wake of the Iraq War, the Stop the War Coalition became the strongest anti-war movement in Europe and the biggest protest movement Britain has ever seen so far. On February 15, 2003, almost 1 million people joined the rally in London against the war in Iraq. Many were very astounded when in spring 2002, the Muslim Association of Britain, I call it MEB, collaborated with the Stop the War Coalition. This obscure Islamist organization was run mainly by Muslims with Arab background, and thus were not representative for British Muslims who mainly come from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, and lately from Somalia, and they have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood. The chair, Indian-born Ghayasin Siddiqui, was known as a supporter of the fatwa against Salman Rushdie. Now I ask the question, how can we explain this alliance? The Stop the War Coalition was obviously impressed that in spring 2002, this was the peak of the Second Intifada, 80,000 British Muslims joined pro-Palestinian demonstrations against by the MAB. Obviously, the Stop the War Coalition expected that the MAB would mobilize British Muslims against the war in Iraq, since the war was very unpopular among British Muslims, many of whom were supporters of Labour and now were deeply disappointed by Tony Blair. Especially young Muslims, men and women, some for the first time in their lives, were ready to take part in demonstrations for something other than a religious matter. The MAB, on the other hand, needed the Stop the War Coalition to strengthen its position among Muslims outside the Arab community and also to assume a leading role among the many competing Islamist organizations in the UK. But the MAB agreed to work with the Stop the War Coalition only under certain conditions. The possibility to have gender-segregated sections at demonstrations and to accept segregated meetings, which means that Muslim women would sit in segregated areas with video screens permitting them to see the stage. Another, or maybe the most important factor, was the integration of the issue of Palestine into the general campaign. since anti-Zionism was a constituent element of the MAB. The Second Intifada was also the first time that Palestine became important among a broader segment of British Muslims. Kashmir, for instance, has so far been of much greater importance. Obviously, they both hoped that Palestine will mobilize Muslims. There was a debate within the Stop the War coalition concerning the gender segregation, but there was a strong agreement on anti-Zionism. The Stop the War coalition and the MAB also agreed that Jews are welcomed, but that there will be no coalition with Zionists and Israelis. Obviously, a radical anti-Zionism served as common denominator between the Islamic MAB and the radical left. Very soon, the Stop the War coalition connected the Intifada with the war in Iraq, expressed in slogans such as Stop the War, Free, Free Palestine, No War in Iraq, Justice for Palestine, No War for Oil and Israel, and also Bush Sharon killer and Zionism is the cancer of the world. Neither in France nor in Germany has Palestine so often been connected to the Iraq war. So the peak was reached with the anti-Iraq rallies in 2002 and at the beginning of 2003. The Stop the War coalition was still able to mobilize up to 100,000 demonstrators during the Gaza war in 2014. This was the biggest pro-Gaza demonstration in Europe, maybe worldwide. In France, which was the focus of international media demonstrations in Europe, which was the focus of international media coverage, demonstrations attracted 30,000 participants. In Germany, in several cities, there were approximately 3,000 participants. Contrary to France, demonstrations in Britain did not end in front of synagogues, but were directed against the Israeli embassy. But it's very important for me to avoid giving a one-sided impression of the many British participants in anti-war demonstrations. It has to be emphasized that many went into the streets to prevent a war in Iraq and did not necessarily support the opinions of the Stop the War coalition or the MAB concerning Israel's right to exist or suicide attacks in Israel. Nevertheless, there is still the question why there was so little protest against anti-Semitic slogans and speeches. Now, briefly come to the Israel boycott movement. Right from the start, there has been an intensive collaboration between the Stop the War coalition and the Israel boycott movement. Many leading players belong to both movements. It is also striking that the leading figures are mostly in their 50s and 60s, and thus were politically socialized in the 70s and 80s, which I think is very important. The British Israel boycott movement has a long tradition and is much stronger than its counterparts in other European countries. The still active Palestinian Solidarity Campaign was founded as a reaction to the Lebanon war in 1982. Additionally, there were also religious groups, unions, and many Muslim organizations propagating various boycotts of Israel. During the Second Intifada, I think it's well known here, the British university unions became active or got international coverage at their annual conferences, where they regularly suggested adapting a resolution to boycott Israeli university. For me, it is interesting that the driving force behind this yearly boycott debates at universities was a small group associated with the Trotskyite Socialist Workers' Party that was successfully mobilizing its followers. With the founding of the BDS in 2005, and I think nourished by the war in Lebanon and the Gaza wars, the sport and cultural boycott started to develop. And now we have new actors, and these are very active British filmmakers like Ken Loach, musician Brian Eno, Mike Lee, or Roger Waters. So I think there's a change now in the boycott movement because these popular figures are now kind of leading figures. A new phenomenon I thought was interesting during the Gaza war in 2014 was the approach of grassroots movements and thus a younger generation. Using new social media became important now, and some of these groups put films online showing people storming into a store and throwing Israeli products on the ground or lying down in a Sainsbury branch in a so-called die-in, which was meant to symbolize Sainsbury's complicity for the dead Palestinians. So for me, it's very interesting when I teach anti-Semitism at the University of Salzburg, students don't know what BDS means. And we have also a lot of German students, so for me, it's very interesting that, and that is an example for me that we can talk about the European anti-Semitism, but they really differentiate between countries. It is also remarkable that in the UK, with references to the National Socialist boycotts are not used that often, that for example in Germany or Austria. If they are used, boycott supporters immediately argue that Israel is built on ethnic cleansing. Observing the boycott movement since 2000, it is evident that during the Intifada, positions were much more differentiated than they are now. Like at 2002, for example, there were debates where some people supported the boycott because they were hoping to end or to come to a two-state solution. And now I think it often seems that the boycott aims to end the existence of Israel. The next point I want to make or want to explain are images of Jews, Israel, and Palestine. This is based on speeches, websites, slogans, placards, and I also was intensively watching YouTube videos, which was actually a torture, I must say. I will sum up the most prominent images of Israel, Palestine, and also Jews. I think it's well known that caught in a simple black and white thought pattern, the Jewish state is portrayed as a terror state and condemned for committing systematic genocide. Thus, Israel's right to exist is questioned like in the 1970s and 80s. Israel is often called the Zionist entity. Often comparisons between Israel and the Nazis were thrown. Nevertheless, these are very global patterns. I think they're not very British, but there are also some British characteristics, and it is remarkable that there are many references to the war 1948 to justify today's critique of Israel. Thus, the war is always reduced to a genocide of the Palestinians, whereas the UN partition plan was never mentioned. Referring to 1948 is also meant to criticize British colonialism and contemporary British government, which is seen as responsible for the entire disaster. Interestingly, in France, Austria, Germany, the year 1948 has little meaning to the contemporary debates. Expectedly, Palestinians are also not seen in their complexity. They are portrayed as innocent, pure children and women and eternal victims of Israel and of the entire West, as well as admired resistance fighters. Whereas attacks in the US, like 9/11, were condemned, suicide attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian organizations in Israel were downplayed and interpreted as legitimate resistance to Israel's occupation of Muslim land in a colonial war. During the war in Lebanon and the previous wars in Gaza, especially young Muslims used slogans such as "We all Hamas, we all Hezbollah." Interestingly, during the last Gaza war, some changes concerning the published images of Israel could be observed. Hardly any slogan such as "We are all Hamas" could be heard or seen on placards. Instead, the demonstrators chanted, "We are all Palestinians," and reduced the images of Palestinians to innocent women and children, and Hamas almost disappeared. Only a very small number of posters comparing Israel with the Nazis appeared in the crowd. This has to be explained in terms of a new strategy of the Stop the War coalition, which censored demonstrators' posters to immunize against charges of anti-Semitism. On their website, they expressed, quote, "In these circumstances, we have had an occasion to ask people to change slogans or to take down placards in order to make it crystal clear that our protest is not against Jews and that we do not equate what's happening in Gaza with the Holocaust." Nevertheless, Zionism was still regarded as a justified political ideology. During the Gaza war in 2014, people expressed this position when chanting, "Are we anti-Semitic? No." And "Are we anti-Zionists?" followed by enthusiastic yes. It is interesting which placards and slogans were still regarded as appropriate. Obviously, slogans such as "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," or placards with "Stop the massacre, Israel is terrorist," were regarded as a legitimate anti-Zionist position. As previously mentioned, the Stop the War coalition was also eager to include Jewish people if they distanced themselves from Zionism. The British Israel boycott movement actually has many active Jewish members, and some small anti-Zionist boycott and small anti-Zionist Jewish organizations are also supporters of the Stop the War coalition.
Two more minutes.
Okay. The Stop the War coalition also instrumentalized these Jews, like Lindsay Sherman of the Socialist Workers' Party wrote on the Stop the War coalition website. There are many Jews who define themselves as anti-Zionists, many of whom have played brave roles in opposing all forms of racism. At every demonstrations they speak, carry banners and fully participate in action, and they are always well received by the whole crowd. A member of the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign in Brighton went one step further by telling the Jewish community to distance themselves from Israel and to show that there is not a divide between Jews and non-Jews. Another problematic strategy was to instrumentalize the ultra-Orthodox and anti-Zionist NATO Reich cartel, whose members are often described as the real rabbis. Finally, I want to mention that the images we find in Muslim communities are very similar to images given by the left, radical left, and also very often by Main Street. This raises the question if whether and to what extent can we even speak of a genuine Muslim anti-Semitism. And we also, I think, have always regarded the very heterogeneity of Muslims or the Muslim population in Europe and the special history and from which country they are coming. I can't go into detail now, but I want to suggest at the end of my paper that the motives are very simple, the images are very simple, but we have to do more research on the various motives. For example, whereas non-Muslims, leftist liberals often identify with Palestinians because they feel guilty about British colonialism and racism, Muslims feel themselves as victims of colonialism as well as of Da West and of Islamophobia, as they call it. Leftists and liberals do not all often accept this all too simple victim role and thus are often unable to develop a multifaceted view of and critical stance towards Muslim organizations. I will end with the suggestion to analyze the Stop the War coalition and the Israel boycott movement in a much broader context, which has to include the crisis of left and liberals and debates about British multiculturalism, as well as the very complex and complicated identities of British, respectively European Muslims. So thank you.